Hello and welcome to the second lecture for topic 7, and this lecture is going to be taking a look at student speech. So coming out of our lecture on hate speech, that a lot of what the court focused on in Snyder v. Phelps was the content of the speech. And that freedom of speech, content is a really important issue, but it's not the only issue that the court is concerned with. And so in Snyder v. Phelps, the court was saying, okay, what was the content of the speech? Was the speech trying to communicate a message? They felt that it was, and so it got these protections. But content isn't the only thing that courts look at when considering freedom of expression cases. The court also looks at the context in which these words are uttered or where this expression is taking place. The context in which words are uttered is also important. And so in your textbook talks about that there's different forums where speech can take place, and there's different levels of protection in these different forums. So take, for example, going back to the Snyder v. Phelps case, that expression was taking place in a public park. Remember that the Westboro Baptist Church was making their expression on publicly owned land. And public parks, public sidewalks, those are seen as these traditional public forums that get a lot of protection, that people go to parks for a variety of reasons, one of which could mean to communicate their ideas. And so those traditional public forums get a lot of protection. But there are other public forums that get less protection because the purpose of these forums is different, and that the state has a specific purpose in some forums that it doesn't necessarily have in a public park. So take, for example, a polling place. A polling place is often takes place in a public arena, a school or a library. And that the purpose of a polling place is to make sure that people can come and vote, and that the state has an interest in making sure that that voting takes place in a way that where people can come and vote, they don't feel harassed or harangued, or they just come and vote, and they should be able to leave without being proselytized to. And so the state's interest in a public polling place is really different than it is in a traditional forum such as a public park, because the goal of the state is to make sure that people can vote. And so where that expression takes place, the context of that expression matters as well. So when it comes to student speech, we're looking at speech that's taking place in public schools. And the question is do public schools, constitute a special setting that permits an elevated degree of speech regulation? You're going to see in your textbook that yes, a public school has a certain purpose, and that purpose is to educate students. And therefore, the state has an obligation to make sure that the environment in the school is conducive to learning. The question is to what degree can the school crack down on student speech? And that is the issue that is explored in the two cases that we're going to look at next, Tinker v. Des Moines and the Morse Bong Hits for Jesus case. Another question is that do minors have the same expressive rights as adults? And so not only are we talking about the public speech in a particular forum, but the question is always the question is always been considered as to what degree the First Amendment applies to children, to minors. Okay, so that's another aspect of student speech cases. What we find is that the court tries to strike a balancing act. On the one hand, as you're going to see, that the courts have not concluded that students check their First Amendment rights at the door when they enter into a school. They do recognize that students have a right to freely express themselves, but it's a balancing act, as you're going to see in these cases, between the students' right to freely express themselves balanced off the rightful authority that school officials have to control conduct in school. So let's take a look at the two cases that your textbook talks about, Tinker v. Des Moines and then the Bong Hit for Jesus case. All right, so let's talk about Tinker v. Des Moines, a case from 1969, and let's talk about the facts of the case. The two pictures there are of the two Tinker children. These are two children that you're going to learn that you read about in your textbook that engaged in a protest at their public school. And their names were Mary Beth and Paul, and that the picture from the bottom is the armbands that they wore for the student protest. And then on the top are them as adults. And I guess that I don't guess, they go on these things called the Tinker Tours that brings the issue and promotes the idea of freedom of expression in schools. And so there they are as adults. So as you read in your textbook, this case took place in 1965, and that in the city of Des Moines, that there was a group of both adult and secondary school students that planned to protest the Vietnam War. That the protest was twofold. On the one hand, the protesters were going to fast, so they were against the Vietnam War. And so to show that they were against the Vietnam War, that they were going to fast. And so there were two dates that they were going to fast on, December 16th and January 1st. And this was to basically show their commitment to pacifism and ending the war. And then in between December 16th and January 1st, that those protesters were supposed to wear black armbands that are showed in the photos there every day in between those two fasts. Okay. Now, the principals of the Des Moines schools, they found out about these plans to protest, and they were really worried about not the fasting part of it, but the wearing the armbands to school part of it. This was a time period where students, their brothers, and sometimes in the case their sisters, might have been fighting or serving in the Vietnam War. And so this was a time of, heightened conflict, about disagreement over the war. And the principals were really worried that if the students wore these armbands to school, that it would cause disruption. And so because they were worried about the disruption, they announced that students who wore armbands to school would be suspended. And so there would be a consequence for them wearing the armbands. Now, the vast majority of the students who were going to participate in this protest decided not to. They didn't want to get suspended. It turns out that only 5 students wore armbands, 2 of which were the Tinker kids, Mary Beth and Paul. They had been, involved in other protests for civil rights, anti-war protests. So they were used to this kind of protest, and they were committed to it. So 5 of the students that wore the armbands, 5 students wore armbands, 3 of the students were suspended, including the Tinker children. The parents sued the school district, saying that the students' freedom of speech was unconstitutionally restricted. And that's the question that comes to the court. Okay, so here's some critical thinking questions to think about Tinker v. Des Moines before we take a look at how the court ruled. So what do you think? Do you think that students should have First Amendment rights? Not that they wouldn't have First Amendment rights outside of school, but do you think that the First Amendment, freedom of speech, applies to conduct within schools? Most justices in the United States Supreme Court, since Tinker onward, do not think that students check the First Amendment at the door when they walk into the school. But not all of them. As you read in your textbook, Justice Clarence Thomas does not think that students have First Amendment rights, that they do check those at the door. So what do you think? Is there any validity in that position? Another thing to think about is that the school officials said the students could let their viewpoint be known in other ways, that they could hold an organized discussion, making a case for opposing the war. They were fine with that. But that they could engage in the fast. They could express themselves in that way. They just didn't want the students to wear the armbands because they were worried that those armbands were going to somehow be disruptive. And also that, like, if you're walking down the hall, like if you have a student forum, a student could choose not to go to the forum. Maybe they didn't want to be presented with those ideas and they could choose not to go. But a student that's in the hallway and looks at the Tinker kids walking by with the armbands, they don't really have a choice to not see it, right? And it might upset them. And so what do you think about that? To what degree is the students' freedom to express themselves impinged by not being allowed to wear the armbands? And also, in this instance, do you think the students are justified in suspending the students? that the students in the textbook, it talks about how the students came, wore the armbands. There was no disruptions. It didn't cause chaos. Yet they suspended the students anyways. They were like, if you do it, we're going to suspend you. Well, the fear that they had that this would cause disruption didn't take place, right? It just, the other students were okay with it. And so do you think that the school district was correct in suspending the students, even though the harmful effect they thought would come about did not come about? Let's look at how the court rules. So the question before the court in Tinker v. Des Moines is the wearing of armbands by public school students during the school day a form of protected speech under the First Amendment? And the Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision says yes, wearing the armbands is protected. Let's take a look at their reasoning. They looked at the content of the speech. And so they said wearing the armband is closer to like sort of pure or true speech than disruptive conduct, because they were trying to communicate a political message. And so, and thus it deserves this higher protection. So if the speech, though, had taken on a different sort of content, that it was provocative or that it was obscene in some ways or sort of against sort of the codes of behavior of the school, they might have ruled differently. But they were like, armband, very traditional way of expressing yourself. It's communicating a political message. Therefore, it deserves high protection, even if it takes place in a school. They say, look, teachers and students do not lose their constitutional right of free expression once entering the school. And so the Supreme Court kind of answers that question, that the First Amendment does apply to students even or minors even when they're in school. Now, they do say that schools have the authority to set rules and conduct to ensure a scholarly atmosphere. And so the court recognizes that. They're not like anything goes. When my son was in junior high and high school, he had these sort of provocative shirts that he wanted to wear to school. And I was like, dude, you cannot wear that shirt, that's promoting the use of marijuana, to school, or, has a beer can on it, or is like, has a picture of burning a flag, right, from some anarchy musical group. You can't wear that. And he's like, why not? Freedom of expression. And it's like, no, the school has the authority to, basically tamp down or restrict expression that is in violation of their rules of conduct, and also that are not going to be disruptive. And so the court recognizes that in Tinker. However, the court says that the armbands were not disruptive to the work of the school or classes. Nobody was upset. It went off with actually little to no commentary. And so that with no valid reason for regulating speech, students are entitled to express themselves. The dissenters obviously disagreed and said that it's a myth to say that a person has a constitutional right to do whatever they please, wherever they please, whenever they please. And so that they were more willing to contract or constrict the expressive rights of not just students, but of others as well. Okay, so the key takeaway from Tinker or the key takeaways from Tinker is that students don't check their First Amendment at the school, First Amendment rights at the school door. Schools do have the authority to punish expression that is disruptive, that there is a compelling interest to protect the environment that is conducive to learning, and that also the content of the speech matters, right? Had that armband or the expression, the t-shirt that these students were wearing, if it didn't have to do with communicating a political message, it would open the door for the school to crack down on those expressions. But since this was really true speech, the pure speech that was trying to communicate a political idea, the court wanted to make sure that students' freedom to express themselves politically was protected. So let's take a look at a more contemporary case regarding student speech, because the Morse case gives us a sense of the current court's take on student speech. All right, so there it is, the infamous Bong Hits for Jesus, the banner that was the source of a controversy in the Morse v. Frederick's case. So this is a case about the Olympic torch that is making its way through the country on its way to the Olympics that was held in the Salt Lake City in 2002. And so on January 24th, we kind of know what the route is for the torch. On January 24th, 2002, that the Olympic torch relay was going to go through Juneau, Alaska. That's where this case takes place. And it was going to pass in front of the high school in Juneau, Alaska. And the principal of the school, Principal Morse, he was excited about this, and he planned a school activity for watching the torch. So the activity was that students could leave class to come outside as the torch was going through their town. It was a school-approved event. Students were allowed to be on either side of the streets. There were cheerleaders there. There was a school band performing at the event. Okay, so this was a school-sponsored event during the school day. Joseph Frederick, a senior, stood with his friends on the street, and they planned to disrupt this event. And as the torch runs by, there are all these TV cameras around. It's getting coverage because it's like, oh, fun in Juneau, Alaska. That they unfurl a 14-foot long banner as the torchbearers run by. Yay, seniors. And it says, bong hits for Jesus. So as the torch runners are running by, TV cameras are covering it. They unfurl the flag and it says, bong hits for Jesus. The principal demands that the students lower the banner. All the other students did, but not Morse, because he's like, it's his idea. He's going to keep holding it up, and he gets in trouble for that. He's suspended for school for 10 days on grounds that he violated policy forbidding students from advocating drug use. See, bong hits for Jesus. Even Jesus does the drugs. And Frederick sues the school, saying his freedom of speech rights have been violated. Definitely a different message that is being promoted here in this case than the one we find in Tinker. But just because the message is different, let's see how the court rules in terms of whether or not this expression is protected. All right, and here are just some critical thinking questions to get you to think about Morse v. Frederick before we look at how the court rule. So in the Tinker case, the court said armbands was closer to pure speech than disruptive conduct because it was trying to communicate an important political message. What about this banner? Is this pure speech? Is it trying to communicate a message? We look at the protections that the Westboro Baptist Church received because they were trying to, we might find that speech offensive, but they were trying to communicate a message. Is Frederick trying to communicate a message here? Is he basically trying to communicate something about that drugs aren't that bad? Is it pure speech? Is this disruptive conduct? I mean, is unfurling that banner gonna like people are gonna get angry and like take it down like the other students? Is it disruptive, or is it just kind of a joke? One could say it's not even, is this even speech? It's just like gobbledygook, just gibberish. Bong hits for Jesus. What does that even mean? If it's just gibberish, then it's not speech and it wouldn't get protections. So what message is the banner communicating? Is it a political or social message? Do you think the context matters here? If you're in a school assembly and you unfurl that banner, or if you're in a school assembly and the principal's making a serious address to the student body and somebody runs by with a banner saying bong hits for Jesus, the disruptive aspect of that is going to be much greater than at this outside school event where it was just bands, cheerleaders. And so are the interests of the school different at an outside school sponsored event than inside this, like at a school assembly? Do you think that the school is justified in suspending Frederick because he refused to drop the banner? Much like Tinker, it didn't cause any disruption, right? And all the other kids dropped it. It was kind of a non-event. Do you think that the school isn't justified? That, like the Tinkers, even though it's not communicating a serious message, is holding the banner protected by the First Amendment? Let's see how the court rules on this. So the question before the court in this case is, does a principal's restriction of student speech, which might reasonably be viewed as promoting illegal drug use at a school event, violate the First Amendment? And in a close decision, in a 5-4 vote, the court says that the actions of the principal did not violate the First Amendment rights of the student. And Chief Justice Roberts writes the opinion in this case. First, he says that this is a school speech case because it's at a school-sanctioned event. So for him, didn't matter whether it was really inside the assembly hall or outside the school. This was a sponsored event. School children were said, hey, instead of going to class, we're going to go over here and watch the torch. And so it was a school-sanctioned event. This is where I think it gets a little slippery. I'm not sure if you agree with this or not. That Roberts in the majority says it's reasonable to construe that the banner was a pro-drug banner, that it's promoting drug use. He said, what is any other meaning there, right? I mean, it's like bong hits for Jesus. Even anybody, use drugs, take bong hits, right? He sort of saw it as promoting a message. They didn't view this as a political debate regarding drug use. Agree with that. It's not gibberish. They thought that it did have a meaning and that meaning was to promote drug use. And as such, the school has a compelling interest in preventing illegal drug use that allows for the restriction of speech. Again, the balancing act, right? That the students make an expression, it has a meaning, promoting drug use, but because while in another context, you could, have a public forum at the local, public park or at the local library, sort of the pros and cons of using marijuana, but you can't do that in school because the school has an important role in making sure that kids aren't using drugs. Stevens disagrees with this. Justice Stevens disagrees with this. And, basically he's saying that, look, speech advocating illegal activity can only be censored if it's likely to provoke harm. This sign does not do that, right? So it's sort of like, just because it's saying something about drug use doesn't mean that it actually should be taken seriously. It's like, oh, students are going to see that banner and be like, giddy up, get me some marijuana, right? Stephen's saying that's not likely to happen. And since it's not likely to happen, that you don't want to, like, the slippery slope, you let the school sort of infringe upon that, it kind of opens up the doorway maybe for infringing on other sorts of expression, so that there should be more protections of what students are saying. All right, that's it for this. The lectures for this, there's a lot of material for this second half of the chapter. And so make sure you read course commentary too, because I'll try to make reference to some of the material that we're not able to get to in lecture. And also you can always attend the office hours if you're so inclined as well, or set up office hours if you'd like to go through some of the cases we didn't get to in class. All right, talk to you later.